Okay, so for today's video, we've got this garden that I'm going to show you how to make. Now, take a note of it that there is 0% modeling done in this. Everything that you see here is completely geometry nodes, right? And you can just basically go ahead and scale it, change the size of it. It's completely dynamic. You can simply add more. Okay, so I hope you guys are ready. This is going to be a long video, so stay with me till the end because there's a lot to learn. All right, then let's get right into it. All right, so before we even start, let me just tell you that we have already reached 994 subscribers. We're just 6 subscribers away to reach that 1,000 mark. So if you guys have not subscribed yet, I would really request you guys to go ahead and subscribe. Help me reach that 1,000 subscribers. And all right, so we have a default Blender scene here. I'm gonna click on A and then delete everything. I'm gonna do a Shift A and add a plane. And then let's move to the geometry nodes editor. Let's click on new to add a new geometry node tree. I'm gonna disconnect the group input from the group output because we're gonna need this plane, but not right now. We'll bring it in later, right? So to start with, I'm gonna add a curved circle. Let's bring down the resolution to 4 and let's plug this into the output to see what exactly we are doing here. We're gonna use this to make the petals of the flower that we're gonna create. So for that, I'm gonna do a Shift A and add a transform node because it's way too even right now. So I'm gonna just make it a little bit more thicker and thinner in different places, right? So on the x-axis, I'm gonna change the scale to 2, and y-axis, let's bring it down to 0.5. And then we'll also add a curve fillet node just to make sure that we are beveling these edges. And let's switch it from Bezier to Poly, and let's bring it up to 5, and let's bring this up to 0.2. Okay, so now we've got a basic structure. Now let's fill this curve. Like for that, I'm gonna click on Fill Curve, like bring in this node and plug this right in here, and just make sure that it's set to n-gons, right? Now, in this entire tutorial, I'm going to try and keep the number of faces that we are adding in this to minimum, because the more faces we add to it or the more geometry we add to it, the more memory capacity that's going to take, right? So we're going to make sure that we keep it as optimized as possible. And that's the reason why n-gons, because if I just enable the wireframes here, and if I click on triangles, can you see there are more faces that are getting added if I click on triangles? So I'm going to keep it on n-gon. All right, so this entire thing is what I'm going to use as a petal. So let's do a Control J and let's name it petals. Now the reason I'm doing this is you will know in some time that it's gonna get really messy, and so yeah, just try and keep things as organized as we possibly can. So the next thing we'll add is a curved spiral, and we're going to use this to actually create our flower. So we're going to increase the rotation to 3.5. I'm going to bring down the resolution to about 20. Let's bring the start radius to 0.1, end radius to 0.1. We can bring down the height to 0, or maybe just keep a little bit of it. Okay, so once we have that, now the next node that we'll add is instance on point, and we will instance this petal that we just created onto this. There's one thing that I forgot, and let's do that real quick. Can you see the origin point of this petal is in the center? We don't want that. We want it to be at the edge of it, right? So somewhere around here looks better. Okay, so I'm going to do 1.2 for my origin point. Let's instance it back and let's see. So let's do a little bit changes in this so that we get that flower look. So I'm going to get a position node here and also align Euler to vector. I'm going to take this position output, put it in the rotation and put it in the vector. Change this from auto to X, and let's put this into rotation. Actually, not X, it's Z. It kind of looks like a flower, but nowhere close to it right now. There are a few other things that we need to do just to make sure that we are getting there, right? Now, there are way too many petals here. So let's control it somehow, right? So we're going to add a delete geometry right after the curve spiral. And then we're going to bring in a math node and change this to ping pong. So we're going to take this and put this into the selection. We're going to use the index. Now we're just basically going to count the index and just take every alternate values, right? So let's use this and just bring this down to 0.05. Now we're pretty much set up here. So let's do some rotation onto this, right? So we're going to add a rotate instances node right in here. Go ahead and do some rotation, right? So let's bring this on to the z-axis, just I'm gonna do a minus 90 degrees, just making sure that it's aligned properly, right? Because as you can see, it's slightly tilted, and I don't want that. I want it to be exactly straight. So minus 90 somewhat gives me what I'm looking for, right? And I can just use the Y value to bring it up or down. I can maybe increase the height a little bit more so that the petals are not just sticking together. Yeah, I think this looks fine. Apart from this, we're going to duplicate this rotate instances, and let's bring all of these back to 0. And I'm going to add a random value node in here, right? Let's change it to a vector, and let's plug this in into the rotation. It just goes haywire. We're going to bring down the X value and the Z value in here and just keep the Y value, right? So what we are doing is we're basically adding some randomization into the way it's going, into the way that it's going upwards, right? So I think a randomization of 0.2 is fine. All these petals are of the same size, but what we want to do is we want to have smaller petals at the center of it and also below as well, right? So how do we do that? Well, one node that we can use to do that is a curve parameter node. So we're going to bring this in and we're going to plug this into the scale. Now, as soon as I do that, it just creates the gradient from smaller to bigger, but it's not quite what we want. So how do we control that? Well, we can simply control that by adding a color ramp. And let's add another one here, and let's make it all the way down to 0. And let's add another one here, bring this up. So why we are doing that is just to make sure that all the edges are still bigger and there's a nice gradient around that, but the center is somewhat smaller, right? So that's what we're trying to achieve here. So just play with it. Again, you can give different shapes to your flower just depending on what you come up with here. I'm gonna reduce the number of petals to somewhat 12. I think it's totally fine. You can also increase the start and the end radius if you want to just give a little bit more space in the center, right? So I think we are pretty much done here. Let's bring the value a little bit up. I think this looks fine. Flower usually have a centerpiece over here as well, right? So let's create that, but just before that, let's quickly do a cleanup. All right, so we've got our flower ready. So let's also add a join geometry now. Again, let's plug this in right here. And what we'll do is we'll add an icosphere, right? And give it 2 subdivisions. And let's plug this in the center. So now we've got that centerpiece that we need. It's way too big right now, so I'm going to just bring the scale down. And I'm also going to add a transform node just to squish. And this is just to make sure that I'm squishing it a little bit on the z-axis, right? Actually bring this up a little bit, make sure it's right in the center. We are done with the centerpiece as well. I'm not going to do a detailed geometry because we need a lot of it, right? So the more I add it, the slower it gets, and I don't want to do that. Plus also, instead of using B-spline here in the color ramp of scaling stuff, I'm going to choose constant. And let's add a few more just to make sure that things are a little bit more stable, right? Also, what we can do is we can simply add a scale instances here. Let's plug this in here, and also just simply randomize the scale, right? So let's put this in here. Let's bring it up right up to 0.5 to 0.7. 0.7 to 1. That's what we're going to go with. And let's uncheck the wireframe. Okay, so this is how our flower is looking like. I'm going to enable shadows and cavity just to make sure that I see it a bit better. And just make sure you're unchecking the local space from the scaling stuff. So the next thing that we'll do is that we'll add a stem that actually connects the flower to the petals. What we can start with is a line. So let's add a curve line. We're going to go ahead and plug this into the join geometry. I don't see anything yet, and that's because we're going to go ahead and bring in this transform node and just bring it down a bit. So I see this line now, right? Let's model it a little bit within geometry nodes itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to change it from curve to mesh. Let's bring in a curve circle, and we're going to use plug this into the profile curve. Now it adds this into there. We're going to bring down the resolution to 10 and bring this down as well. Let's increase the size to about 2. Yeah, just so that it's touching up there. I'm also gonna go ahead and resample the curve because I need a little bit geometry in this. And the last thing that we'll add into this is a set curve radius. So what we'll do is we'll add a curve parameter like we did before, and we're gonna plug this into the radius. Now, as soon as I do that, can you see it's just creating a gradient from 0 to 1? But I want some custom values, right? And the best way to do that is color ramp. So let's add in a color ramp here. I'm going to change it to B-spline because I don't want 0 values. And let's bring this up a little bit because I don't want it to completely go to 0. Now, can you see that if you keep adding stuff into this, you can just simply model anything that you want. Like, for example, this. I can just simply create that stem that I was talking about before. So I'm going to increase the size a bit here. It looks really small. So let's go 0.4. Actually, we can even go more. And it's going to take a second to model, but yeah, you basically get the gist, right? So I'm going to just speed through it a little bit. All right, that's pretty much done. The last thing that I want to add in here is another curve circle. I just want to cover this area up where these petals are getting connected to this stem, right? So for that, let's quickly add a curve circle. Let's bring down the resolution to 10 again, and we're gonna go ahead and plug this in right here into this joint geometry. Let's use the same nodes that we have here, that is curve to mesh, and we can bring in another curve circle just to wrap around it. Now let's bring down this and bring this down as well. All right, so we're gonna add another transform node in here. So let's duplicate this transform node and let's bring this up so that it's just connecting right here, right? All right, cool. This is a workable flower, you could say. And for the icosphere that I added in the center, what I could do is I could just go ahead and shade smooth, right? So that it's nice and clean. Okay, cool. So our flower is pretty much ready. So I'm gonna just clean it up again. All right, so we have our flower ready, right? So let's quickly go ahead and select everything in here and let's do a Control J again, name it flower. So now that the flower is done, the next thing that we want to do is leaves, right? So how do we create a leaf? Well, this is an interesting way that I discovered while I was experimenting with it. So we're going to add a curve line in here. Okay. And I'm going to go ahead and plug this in right here. What we'll do is we'll do a mesh to curve, a curve to mesh. And let's bring in another circle here, curve circle. I'm gonna plug this in right here. Now we'll just basically use this to model a leaf. So we're gonna bring down the resolution to 4. And what we'll do is we'll go ahead and add a transform node. Let's plug this right after this. And let's bring down the Y value right about 0.1. Can even go lower. 0.05 is okay too. We'll add a set curve radius again, and we'll just basically use curve parameter and color ramp to model this again, right? So curve parameter and a color ramp. Now let's also add a resample curve because we're going to need some resolution here. Let's bring it about 15 and let's bring this here. Let's add another one. Let's go down. Okay. Let's bring down this value too. Just make it look like a leaf. Now this looks oddly shaded, and that's because we're gonna make sure that set shade smooth is unchecked. Now let's add B-spline. Let's make sure that there's a smoother transition here, and let's bring this in. Now as you can see, this pointy part of the leaf is getting created. So we're gonna bring this up because I don't want the bottom to look like that. Bring this up. And also just control the size of the bottom connector, right? So yeah, this kind of looks like leaf, right? So let's bring this down to 10. Actually, that works too. This looks like a pretty decent leaf. Also bring this down a little bit more if you would like. Just make it nice and thin. Okay, so we've got our leaf here. So I'm going to use this as well. So I'm going to do a Control J and let's name it leaves. Now, pretty much done with most of our modeling. Let's connect the original plane here. And what we're going to do is we're going to distribute some faces on it. So distribute points on faces, and I'm going to join this back onto the original geometry. Put in a join geometry node here so that we see the original plane too. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to instance a mesh, not a mesh, but a curve line on it. Now, these are what we're going to use to create our stems, right? So let's add an instance on point. plug this right between the joint geometry and the distribute points on faces. We're going to take this curve, we'll plug this in into the instances. Now again, resample curve, and we are just going to sample 10 of these. But basically, this will be the count of leaves that we can add to it. So let's bring this back in here, and we can just name it leaves count. And this is just the size of the stem. So you can also combine X, Y, Z. You can just take the Z value and plug this in here, and let's go 1. So let's rename this stem height. So now that we have got some of our basics set up, we're going to go ahead and do a little bit distortion in this, right? Because trees never grow in a straight line. So let's go ahead and add a set position node, and let's use a noise texture to actually distort it. So we're going to take the noise texture and plug it into the offset. Now it just goes away from where it's supposed to be. How do we fix it? Well, what a noise texture is basically doing is that it's adding 0.5 to each direction of this stem. To go ahead and fix that, and what we can do is we can bring in a vector math node and subtract that 0.5 from it. So now, even if it's distorting it, it's still keeping it in the same position where it's supposed to be and not just taking it away, right? So we're going to bring up the detail right up to 8, bring down the roughness, and bring down the scale somewhat around 1. I think this looks okay. The next thing that we could do is to visualize what's happening here is that we're going to convert it from curve to mesh so that we see what's going on, right? And again, curve circle. This is something that I'm going to do a lot in this because we are using curve primarily, right? Let's bring the resolution down to 3, and let's bring down the stem to somewhat around 0.01. I think that works fine. Now again, set curve radius. Again, you can just basically make a node out of this and just do it. I'm just gonna do it this way so that you guys understand what I'm doing, right? So let's curve parameter, plug this in here, and also a color ramp, change it to B-spline, and flip this. We've got our stems ready. Now it's all happening in one same direction, and we want to randomize that. For that random value node, I'm going to change this to vector and plug this in into the rotation. Now you can see all the stems are just slanting into a weird direction. How do we fix that? Well, it's simple. Let's first make both of these X and Y value 0 so that they are standing straight. And for the Z value, I'm going to add tau. Tau is just basically 360 degrees in radiant values, right? So now all of these stems are randomly rotated in 360 degrees of rotation. But now also what I like to do is I just add a little bit of rotation in both of these axes so that these stems are not completely straight, right? They are just slanting a little bit randomly in different directions, and that just, according to me, add a little bit more realism to it. I'm going to do a shift D and just change it to float, the random value node, and plug it into the scale. Don't want it to go to 0, so I'm going to go ahead and change this to about 0.2 or 3 if you'd like. Again, this totally depends on your preferences. And now that we've got the stem ready, let's quickly take this entire thing and do a Control J, and let's name it stem. Actually, let's name this leaves stem, because we're gonna add different stems, but only for flowers with leaves, and there will be a stem with only leaves, right? So this entire thing is gonna be stem for leaves, right? And we can also just change these values too, just to make sure that we are not confusing them. Leaves count. Okay. So we've got these two controllers here. Let's copy this entire thing because we're going to need it again. Entire node structure, do a shift D. Okay. Let's duplicate this distribute point node as well. I'm going to plug this geometry in here and plug this into the points and plug this back in here. It's distributing the stem in the same direction. So let's add a few more. Yeah. So let's bring in these controls as well, right? So we're gonna first bring in the leaves count here, right? So let's bring this in, leaves count, and let's leaves count, but we're gonna name it flowers, right? So these are the leaves for flowers, for the stems that have flowers. And this is the height for the stems that's gonna have flowers, right? So stem height, flowers. These two things are ready now. Now we're gonna go ahead and instance our leaves onto it because we already created leaves. But let's just make sure that we have limited number here. So stem with flowers. Let's start instancing stuff. So we have got our leaves here. So we're gonna add an instance on point node, and let's put this here. Let's take this instance, just make sure that you're taking it before it's changed into a mesh, right? So we're going to take it from the instance on point node, the output, and plug this into the points here. If you take it from the curve, it's just going to give you really weird results, and half the things that we are doing are not going to work, right? So just make sure that you're taking it from here, and that's really crucial. Let's plug this into the instances, and let's plug this back in right here. Now, all the leaves are here, but it just looks super weird. So let's go ahead and fix that. So let's first add a transform node, and I'm going to bring down the scale of the leaves a bit to 0.2. I think this looks fine. And then I'm going to add a random value node. First, control the rotation. So for that, we're going to change it to vector and plug this into the rotation. And let's bring down, you can play with this. First of all, for the Z1, I'm going to do tau, that is again 360 degrees, because I want it to be randomly rotated on the z-axis. But for x and y, let's put it to 0, and let's try and understand who's doing what. So basically, the x-axis, if you move it, it just moves the leaves up and down, right? So let's put it to minus, y value is, we're going to keep y value to 0.1 and the x value to minus 2. Somewhat, so that the leaves are rotating correctly. So they are randomly rotating, but they are also at the same time rotating a little bit upwards or facing a little bit upwards. So just go ahead and increase our leaf count over here. You can see that. Sorry, one second. You can see that the number of leaves are increasing, right? Okay, so Blender crashed on me, unfortunately, and like an idiot, I didn't save the project before, so I had to recreate the entire node 3 once again. All right, so I'm going to do a Shift A and duplicate the random value node and change it to a float and plug it into our scale for our leaves, right? And let's bring it to about 0.5 to somewhat around 1, right? So now we've got our leaves set up, but now as you can see, the leaves are starting at the base of the stem, and also are available at the top of it as well, right? We don't want that, so how can we control it? Well, we can just simply control it again with the curve parameter node. Again, this node is really useful as far as working with curve goes. Right, so as soon as I add that, all the bottom leaves goes away, but I want the top leaves to go away as well, right? So you can just simply add a color ramp. You can also change it to constant if you'd like, and simply select the amount of leaves that you want to go ahead and display, right? So you can just bring this here. Yeah, simply change it to constant, and you can just shave off the amount of leaves that you want, right? And it will automatically take care of that. Let's wait. So we also have to create the same node at the top as well. So we're going to use pretty much the same values, right? And so we can just simply do Control, Shift, and D. So as soon as we do that, all the connection stays intact, but it just creates a duplicate of the original node, right? So let's come back and let's unmute this. So we'll connect this geometry now to instance on point. Now this is basically our stems with the flowers, right? But they also need leaves. So we are just going to add it separately over here. Now the reason I'm not combining it is because I want to keep both of these work streams separate, right? Now we're going to do a Shift D again normally and instance once again and plug this in to the join geometry. Now we're going to use this instance to actually instance our flowers on it. So let's bring this down, and here is our flower node, right? Let's bring it up a little bit. Okay, so we're going to take the geometry from here and instance it right here. Now again, it just goes haywire, and I don't want that. So let's do let's disconnect it again. So how do we control that? Well, it's simple. For the curve, there's another node that's called endpoint selection, right? So how does this work? This basically gives you 2 points here, that is your start point and your end point. So I want my flowers to be showing up on the end point and not on the start point. So I'm going to just uncheck that. And now if I go ahead and plug in the joint geometry, the flowers are only available at the top of it. Now it doesn't look like it because they are way too big for its size. So I'm going to add a transform node here and let's scale them down by a lot. 0.1 should be a good value for that, right? Now this is our flowers here, and again they are not available on all the instances, and that's because that's how we set it up, right? So let's reduce the density of the flower. So we've got the density here, and this would be a good time to add a controller for this as well. So I'm going to take this density and add it here, and let's rename it flower density. Also, what we could do is we can take this density too and just plug this in here and we can say density without flowers. So now we've got both of our controllers in. Now I can just simply increase these stems if I want to, and it works pretty well for me, right? Now for the flowers, let's do a little bit more randomization here. So the very first thing I'm going to randomize is their scale, right? So let's plug this random value node in the scale. I can even simply increase or decrease it from here. So let's keep it to 0.2 minimum, and maximum still looks a little bit big, so I'm going to bring it down to 0.7. I think our flower setup is done. Our stem setup is done. Also for the flowers, as you can, if we look closely, right, it's not directly right over the stem. It's just floating somewhere around it. So let's bring this up using this transform node just so that it's sticking right onto the point up there and just doesn't look odd. And also for the rotation, I'm gonna go ahead and do a shift D, change it to vector, and add this here. Now you can just simply choose how much rotation you want. Like for example, for the Z, I'm again gonna add a 360 degrees, but for these, let's keep it very low, like 0.2 or 0.3, which just keeps it a little bit randomization in your scene, but not too much, right? I think we are pretty much done as far as geometry nodes setup goes. So now the controls that we have is that we can control the amount of leaves in your scene. You can control the amount of flowers that you have, right? You can just simply increase the density here. And you can also control the amount of stems without flowers, right? With just normal leaves. Again, you can improve this just by adding normal grass in this as well. I'm not going to show that to you. It's just simply the same process, right? So we've got everything ready. So let's start adding materials to it. The very first thing that we want to add material to is our petals. So we're going to go back to our petals and we're going to click on set material and plug this right here. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and add a material here and let's name it petals so that we know what's going on. Now, again, the reason I'm keeping it so tidy is because it just gets super confusing if you just look at this amount of nodes that we are using here, right? So just to keep it a little bit more understandable, this is why we are doing this. So I'm going to hop into my shader editor here, and also right over here, I'm going to switch to cycles because I like cycles when it comes to shading. I'm going to quickly add an HDRI just so that we can see what exactly is happening, right? Also, we'll come over here, we'll click on film and transparent so that we don't have a background that's distracting us, and also just make sure that the in color management, we are changing it to very high contrast. Right, so now that we have this, let's add a color to our petals. So how can we do that? Well, the simplest way that I found was to add a noise texture, and I added a hue saturation node, and I just plugged this into the base color, and well, for subsurface, I just selected somewhat a little bit more purplish look. And let's do 0.4 here. So our flower colors are changing already, right? So now plug this color input into the hue saturation value and increase the saturation value to 5 and also increase the value to 2. And the last thing that we'll do is we'll press a control key, just make sure that node wrangler is enabled, increase the detail to 8, reduce the scale to 1, and if you want, you can bring down the roughness, and just make sure that your mapping node is connected to the camera output. Right, so as soon as you do that, now your flower color will just basically change depending on your camera position, which is super cool when you're actually trying to create a beautiful scene, right? Now even our plane is changing colors, and that's because I added it here. Add another material for your plane, and that will take care of it. So now we've got different color for our flowers. So that's taken care of. So the next thing that we'll actually do is we'll add a material node to our flower base, right? We can just simply add a set material node again, plug this right in here, and let's create a new material, and we're gonna call this flower base. Let's select this. We're going to go into our shader editor again. Let's bring this up a bit. Let's color it green, right? Because again, can color it anything, but I'm gonna go with green. And I'll apply a similar material to the stem that is actually joining it. So set material again, and let's select flower base. We are pretty much done texturing our flowers. So the next thing that we're gonna go ahead and do is texture our leaves. Now, how do we do that? Well, it's simple. We'll come back to our leaf section here, or the leaf group here, add a set material node. We can just simply add a new material here, and let's name it leaves. For leaves, what I did is I basically, for the coloring, I went with the same thing. So I green and green, and let's select leaves here. That's why it's not happening. Okay. And the other leaves, I just made it a little bit darker so that we have that difference. And IRO, I made it 1.333. And the last thing that I actually did was I added a noise texture in here and just added a bump node to it so that the leaves have a little bit more detail on it, right? So let's put the factor into the height, and let's increase this and increase the detail to about 8. And yeah, your leaves instantly look a little bit more realistic as compared to before. Let's bring down the strength a little bit to 0.3. I think that's pretty much it. The last thing that I would really want to give a material to is the flower center, right? So set material node. Let's bring this in here. Let's here, and let's add a new material. Let's say flower center. I don't know what it's called, by the way. And for this one, we are actually going to give a little bit of a yellowish color, right? And note that I'm adding subsurface to everything, and that's because it just gives a little bit more organic look as compared to the other thing, right? So helps out. Again, I'm trying to do things fast, so that might just be my little cheat code, you could say. Again, set material. Now we're gonna take care of the stems here, right? So set material. For the stem, I'm just gonna create a basic material. Let's say stem. Okay, let's select it here. Again, add a little bit of subsurface, but and the subsurface, I'm gonna add a little bit more brownish color, so that the subsurface is a little bit a mix between green and brown, right? So let's add that. Let's do a Shift D and search for the other one. It's right here. Yeah. So as you can see, it's like it's already giving that look, right? And if I just increase this, make it a little bit darker, make this a little bit darker too. And there we have it. All right, I'm not going to show you how to go ahead and change the plain color. You can decide it on yourself. You can maybe add a little bit displacement to it as well. But we are pretty much ready. All you have to do is just hop into the edit mode and change the scale of it. If you like, you change the shape of it. And this just basically goes ahead and creates your garden. You can just give it custom shapes if you want to. And yeah, anything works with it. So I hope that this video was helpful. I know it was super long. It's one of my really long videos. So thank you so much for staying till the end with me. But if it was helpful, don't forget to drop that like. If you want to see more videos like it, let me know down in the comment section. And yeah, don't forget to subscribe. We are about to reach 1,000. So I hope that you guys subscribe and we reach that mark as soon as possible. All right, then. Thanks so much for hanging out, guys. I'll see you guys in the next video.